Okay, that was a wonderful introduction, Joe. Thank you. And before I begin, I want to thank the Center for Mark Twain Studies, and especially Joe and Steve for welcoming me to Quarry Farm, and Katie and Jessa for helping me navigate the archive. And I also want to thank my professors Sam Otter and Aliza Tamarkin for their feedback on this paper, and Ben Griffin for generously sharing his wisdom and insights on all things Pudd'n'head. And thank you all for coming. I'm super grateful to share my research with you, all in this historic site in honor of the late Professor Kiskus. So my talk is entitled Detecting Twain in Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins. In the first draft of Pudd'n'head Wilson, character Tom Driscoll boasts that his crime of theft and murder will take its place with the permanent mysteries. In a revision, Twain added, and people won't get done trying to guess out the secret of it for 50 years. Although Tom got that wrong, Twain got it right, maybe undersold it by some decades, in the sense that readers continue, as Joe brought up in the introduction, readers continue to search Pudd'n'head Wilson for some secret to Twain and his Reconstruction era mindset. I would argue that there's two main mysteries which detective critics focus on. We yearn to understand what Twain was up to in publishing a poorly revised joint work, and we want to pin down what the combined works say about race. I contend that Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins actually invites both of those inquiries, and I will gesture at how they might be intertwined. A quick summary of the novel to start. Pudd'n'head Wilson is built around a changeling plot in which an enslaved mother, Roxy, responds to the threat of being sold downriver by switching her newborn with the master's infant. The novel then chronicles how the two boys grow up, enslaver and enslaved. The enslaver, Tom Driscoll, doesn't know until Roxy reveals it to him that he is her son, and his great-great-great-grandparent was black. Tom grows up mean-spirited and merciless, and his rage peaks in a moment of stealing from Judge Driscoll, and then choosing to kill him rather than get caught in the act. Bumbling detective Pudd'n'head Wilson, having taken fingerprints of the boys as babies, proves in a final trial scene that Tom was guilty of murder and that he was swapped at birth. The tragic ending is that Tom gets pardoned for killing his uncle in order to be resold into slavery, a full circle moment which speaks to the Reconstruction era deferrals of freedom to formerly enslaved people. But the tragedy throughout the novel is that Roxy, in her position as enslaved, must submit to her own son, and it seems to be this upbringing as enslaver which leads Tom to be such a remorseless person. For these reasons, Langston Hughes, in 1959, wrote that the book's basic theme is slavery, seriously treated, and its main thread concerns the absurdity of man-made differentials, whether of caste or race. Hughes is one of many scholars who have sought to define the novel's take on race. Another, sometimes overlapping inquiry examines the novel's shoddy editing job. As I'll explain in a moment, the novel actually started as a slapstick story of conjoined twins from Italy traveling in the antebellum South. Then Twain added fingerprinting and a detective plot, which required the invention of a crime, and then Twain thought of the baby swap. But Twain neglected to revise these components for consistency. As Herschel Parker puts it in Flawed Texts and Verbal Icons, how can we talk sensibly about characterization throughout a novel when chapters survive from stages when a character, Tom, was white and a stage when he was part black? One way to respond is by attempting to guess out the secret of the novel, as it invites us to do. In fact, through his revisions and his published commentary on those revisions, Twain puts more and more of his authorship on display, cluing the reader into his piecemeal revisions. Indeed, Pudd'n'head Wilson, the novel, doesn't hide its own Pudd'n'headness. In the postscript, Twain calls himself not a born and trained novelist, but rather a jackleg one. So the chain-smoking caricature on the right is how illustrator Frank M. Sr. depicted the jackleg novelist in the 1894 American Publishing Company edition. I read this self-abasement, Twain calling himself a jackleg, as more than just Twain's downplaying persona. Rather, this quote in context reads to me as evidence that Twain is specifically concerned with the epistemological demands of authoring a novel about detecting and producing race. So in this lecture, I'll look at how the joint works entangle the detective plot, the construction of race, and Twain's own process of writing. I aim to show how this palimpsestic publication forces the reader to confront Twain's incoherence as an author, at the same time that his comments on fingerprints and markers expose the instability of race as a defining category. Ultimately, I'll argue that these two parallel tracks, the formation of both authorship and race, problematize any static definition of identity. I'll begin with an in-depth background of the revision history of the conjoined works, PUDD'N'HEAD WILSON and Those Extraordinary Twins. Then I'll look at Twain's resistance to detective fiction and the circumstantial evidence detectives use and abuse to close their cases. Then I'll turn to the specific type of circumstantial evidence key to PUDD'N'HEAD WILSON, the fingerprints, but also weather signs. And finally, I'll conclude with sharing sections of earlier drafts that didn't make it into the final publication, and consider how they contribute to the problem of racial and authorial identity making. I want to credit 4 sources which helped shape my thinking. Susan Gilman's Dark Twins and the essay anthology she edited on PUDD'N'HEAD, Bridget Fielder's book Relative Races, especially the section Roxy's Racial Genealogies, Carlo Ginzburg's Clues, Myths, and the Historical Method, and Sean Shu's book on Mark Twain and comparative racialization, as well as his broad view edition of the novel. This research is also indebted to the Mark Twain Project's Authoritative Edition, edited by Ben Griffin. This 800-page tome contains a wealth of resources, including the never-before-published original version of the novel. Some of you might have attended his Trouble Begins lecture that happened here about a year ago. And I'll use this edition's pagination on the slides. And finally, it has been an opportunity of a lifetime, that's Twain, not me, to stay and write and think in Twain's footsteps at Quarry Farm, with all the books I needed at my fingertips and nothing but green to look at stretching off into the distance. Okay, to begin, revising, 2 stories tangled together. So let's start with this work's revision history to provide some background for the rest of the lecture. PUDD'N'HEAD WILSON and Those Extraordinary Twins began as one work Twain produced rather desperately from 1892 to 1893, while living abroad amidst failed investments in an automatic typesetting machine and the bankruptcy of his publishing company. Strapped for money, Twain reports record-breaking speeds of composition, even 6,000 words in 13 hours. And he wrote in a letter that working on this draft nearly killed me. These 2 maxims from his notes speak to his financial distress and need to publish in this moment. The top says, "The time to begin writing an article is when you have finished it to your satisfaction." That one resonates with my own writing process. A saying which Twain ironically deems usable for his book of maxims. And the second, "Compulsion is the handmaid of genius." I'm now going to turn to a diagram that's also in your handout that was super helpfully put together by Ben Griffin in the 2024 Authoritative Edition, displaying what Twain wrote when in his first draft. The first draft is called the Morgan manuscript, named for the Morgan archives. You can see vertically 5 phases of completion over time, and horizontally which chapters he wrote. So as the diagram reveals, the very first incarnation of the novel was actually chapters 6 through 10, which rehearsed a freak show of conjoined brothers Angelo and Luigi, and closed by introducing PUDD'N'HEAD WILSON and how he got his name. This short draft stalled for a few months until Clemens received a copy of Francis Galton's Fingerprints in early November 1892, and a few days later, determined to bring the new forensic science into the sideline story. Within a month, Twain had written 17 more chapters and developed Wilson as a detective, the twins as potential suspects, a dagger as a weapon, a prominent Judge Driscoll as the victim of murder, and his spoiled heir as the culprit. In mid-December, Twain got inspired to add another dimension to the antebellum world he had been building. In tandem with the Italian twins, doubling the doubles, Twain devised a changeling plot in which master and slave are swapped at birth. In a 2-day recasting of what he had written so far, Twain introduced the character of Roxy and reimagined Tom as a young man raised to believe he's white. With a few more chapters to set up and conclude the narrative, by January 1893, Twain had a complete draft and announced that he had finished that book. Here are some of the inspirations for this novel, as outlined in Griffin's introduction. The conjoined Chang and Eng brothers, whose story Twain fictionalized in his 1869 Personal Habits of the Siamese Twins. The Tochi brothers, whose photograph he saw in a Scientific American supplement in 1892. Francis Galton's Fingerprints, also published in 1892. And Dion Boucicault's 1859 play, The Octoroon. After sending, as you can see, multiple themes, after sending this overcrowded draft to his publisher, fretting over whether to sell it by subscription, and contending with how, as he says after the fact, Livy would not consent that this version be published either before or after my death, Twain decides he needs to revise. As he puts it in his postscript, I had a sufficiently hard time with that tale because it changed from a farce to a tragedy while I was going along with it. So in summer 1893, Twain performed what he called a literary Caesarean operation, extracting the scenes featuring the conjoined twins and actually physically separating the twins from each other in the scenes that he couldn't easily cut, and streamlining the novel he would entitle Pudd'n'head Wilson. You can see here a zoom in of another drawing by Frank M. Sr. of Twain having pulled one of the stories out by the roots. That's those extraordinary twins, as his mind refocuses on Pudd'n'head, the man on the top right with the top hat. Then, fascinatingly, instead of scrapping this excess, the conjoined twins stuff, and sharing only the streamlined version, Twain chose to publish for an extra $1,500 what he entitled the suppressed farce, Those Extraordinary Twins, alongside the finished product Pudd'n'head Wilson. You might not be able to see this super well, but in this edition, cast-off scenes of the conjoined twins are sutured together by bracketed summaries. These are all summaries right here, which refer back to shared moments from Pudd'n'head. Here is also where he adds the postscript in which he tells the story of his writing process. This whole move was definitely a cash grab, but as suggested by Twain calling the material refuse matter, he refused to let this material go to waste and opted instead to refuse the stories back together. Reception was mixed. The most enduringly popular part about the novel was the detective Pudd'n'head and his pithy maxims heading each chapter. In fact, to promote their serialization of the novel, Century Magazine collected these sayings and published them in Pudd'n'head Wilson's calendar, that's on the left, which they gave, as a great marketing ploy, they gave to subscribers for free. In the middle is an advertisement for the play Twain's Friend adapted from the novel in 1895, and on the right, a keepsake menu from a dinner at the Aldine Club Twain attended, which, displaying continued interest in detecting him, included those fingerprint icons alongside his signature. So now I want to talk about detecting Twain. Circumstantial evidence at fault. As I've introduced, these works invite sleuthing, but at the same time, they work against the detective plot. Twain seemed to believe that life is messy, so then storylines should also be messy. The nature of a detective plot with a clear-cut crime and criminal is especially at odds with antebellum racial dynamics, where, as Lauren Michelle Jackson puts it in her recent review, intimacy and domination were bound together like strands of rope. Both the story of Pudd'n'head Wilson and the story of writing Pudd'n'head Wilson are tangly. And as Twain admits it in his preface and afterward, he only wanted or could extricate so much. Twain acknowledges that direct testimony, even his own, is liable to partiality and prejudice. As he puts it in a marginal note to the history of rationalism in Europe, and this book is actually housed at Quarry Farm, and the marginalia you can see at the very top in his iconic purple pencil. How often this argument is flung at our heads that a thing must be true because a cloud of witnesses have for ages believed it. What a silly argument it is, after all. So while direct evidence, testimony, witness testimony, is faulty, indirect or circumstantial evidence isn't much better. For the trial scene, the aphorism that headlines the chapter, this is also in your handout, states, "Even the clearest and most perfect circumstantial evidence is likely to be at fault, after all, and therefore ought to be received with great caution." It's in this chapter when Detective Wilson accidentally obtains grown-up Tom's fingerprints. And the fingerprints as circumstantial evidence, they do convince the jury that the case is closed, that he committed the murder. But the prints also reveal Tom's ancestry, which is otherwise irrelevant to the case. So it's helpful maybe to step back and look at the climactic trial scene in conjunction with 19th century developments in evidence law. Legal theorists recognize that there's no absolute law to determine which facts are relevant and therefore admissible to a court. Instead, as one lawyer put it a few years after PUDDN'HEAD was published, the principle of relevance works in an atmosphere, not in a vacuum. It is concerned with human conduct and all its elements of fraud, inadvertence, willfulness, and uncertainty. Twain seems to agree that circumstantial evidence is subject to biased interpretation. It asks the jury to decide what is a reasonable inference to draw, which fully depends on their understanding of the crime and its surrounding circumstances. We can see Twain struggling with this dynamic in these two draft maxims for PUDDN'HEAD's calendar. He writes at the top, "Circumstances make man, not man circumstances." In the next one, he kind of says the opposite. Human beings make climate, but then he crosses out human beings to say instead circumstances, then he scratches the whole thing out, indicating his own uncertainty about how this cause and effect works. I think Twain's issue with circumstantial evidence is how it assumes a coherent, enclosed case, rather than allowing for the open-ended messiness of reality. This need for a closed case inevitably leads to confirmation bias, with people making deductive leaps to connect the evidence with conclusions they expect. Interestingly, Twain attacks deductive reasoning directly in his other burlesques of detective fiction. Twain was largely ambivalent about the genre. He praised Poe, but belittled his contemporary Arthur Conan Doyle. Twain writes in 1896 of detective plots, "Was there ever one that the author needn't be ashamed of, except The Murders in the Rue Morgue," which is a story by Poe. In Double-Barreled Detective Story, his awkward parody of Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, a boy named Fetlock Holmes, not Sherlock, Fetlock, says he's learned from his family of detectives that, quote, "if you don't want them to find out about a thing, it's best to have them around when you do it." As with the purloined letter in Poe's famous story, Twain's overactive police detectives look everywhere but what's hiding in plain sight. Detectives are puddinheads, Twain suggests, because they probe deep into those circumstances, projecting their preferred method of ratiocination and thereby missing the facts in front of them. In the same way, Detective Wilson's actually only able to solve Tom's crime when Tom imprints his marks on a piece of glass and holds it up before the light right in front of him. And in the concluding chapter in PUDDN'HEAD Wilson, Twain adds the epigraph, "It was wonderful to find America, but it would have been more wonderful to miss it." That is to say, it would have been incredible for Columbus to have missed the land for which he was directly heading, even if he misidentified it. But it's not just the detectives themselves that Twain derides. It's also the detective plot. PUDDN'HEAD Wilson has all the ingredients for detective fiction: crime, clues, a trial scene, but Twain forecloses the fantasy of a coherent case by constantly shifting culprits and victims, and also sharing with the reader each action as they occur. There's no mystery there. This is partly a rebellion against the all-seeing detective character, but it's also resists the expectation that the detective fiction author construct a neat, self-contained narrative. As Susan Gilman puts it, the deductive powers of the detective inspire a combination of awe and skepticism that Twain himself sometimes expressed toward the author's omniscient eye. As in Huck Finn, whose introductory notice warns that anyone attempting to find a plot will be shot, Twain's paratextual remarks across Pudd'nhead Wilson point to his skepticism about authorial omniscience. We can see this in his first full draft. Twain ended the narrative with this inconclusiveness. This chapter could not be written on account of the weather, the end. It's also falsely dated March 1893. It was at this time that he wrote the note concerning the legal points, which he later renamed Whisper to the Reader. This preface invites the reader to visualize Twain drafting the novel in Florence and subjecting the story to, quote, rigid and exhausting revision and correction by a barrister who had studied the law part of a while in Southwest Missouri 35 years ago. Twain's humor immediately deprecates both the tenuousness of legal authority and that of the revision itself. So here we start to see how Twain not only resists the detective plot he invokes within the novel, but also, almost in its place, puts his own authorship on display, as if to say that if the mystery in the story is a flop, try me instead. Rather than attempt to build that illusion of omniscience, Twain almost defects from his writerly role. For example, of the many names he gives his alter ego, one he puts down in his notebook is Watson, this is also in your handout, who, quote, signs his name in a hand which has no resemblance to mine when he takes possession of our partnership body. As if he were writing, or his writing were the production of a mere narrator to some phantom, disembodied Holmesian author that somehow occupies his own body when he's writing. This is the same passivity that he invokes in his postscript to Pudd'nhead Wilson. As he recounts of his experience writing, fictional characters were, quote, taking things almost entirely into their own hands and working with the whole tale as a private venture of their own, a tale which they had nothing to do with by rights. Here he construes his authorial persona as an incidental victim to his character's crimes. Also in the postscript, he portrays himself as an ineffectual criminal. Given his poor editing practices, he hopes, quote, maybe the reader wouldn't notice it because I changed the subject right away to something else. He's not just being self-deprecatory in this postscript. I'd argue that he's offering his authorship up as a subject of detection, though a pursuit, this detecting pursuit, one that he exposes to be doomed to begin with. Finally, we can also see this shift toward him putting his authorship on display in his choice of frontispieces. For the Century magazine publication, he replaces his clipping from Galton's title page with his own photograph. Rather than double down on the fingerprinting theme, though he recognizes in a letter that it is absolutely fresh and mighty curious and interesting to everybody, he frames the narrative with his own likeness, in a posture that, to me, appears both accessible in its kind of casualness, but also somehow enigmatic. So this foregrounding of his authorial persona responded to and fed into the public search for the real Twain. For example, in 1907, a pesky journalist persisted in holding a hand interview with Twain and even took his handprint. You can see the handprint there on the left. She fabricated this whole article, by the way. Any trace of the jackleg novelist and celebrity was worth studying, even if it was totally irrelevant, like a handprint, to his success or character. So now I want to turn to marking Twain, fingerprints and weather signs, focusing on these two as examples of faulty circumstantial evidence. I hope to show how Twain plays with these identity markers in order to expose the flawed nature of interpreting signs. In particular, Twain questions the reliability of any markings of character when that character, whether author, text, or race, is itself fragmentary and multivalent. The first site where this concern is apparent is his treatment of fingerprints. Pudd'nhead Wilson problematizes fingerprints as an index of identity, especially racial identity. The author Twain was drawing from, Francis Galton, whose 1892 text inspired Pudd'nhead Wilson, Francis Galton was highly invested in using the new forensic technology for racial categorization. In Fingerprints, and you can see some of his table of contents here, Galton recounts how an East India Company administrator, William Herschel, developed the practice of identifying individuals through stamps of their fingers. Herschel and other white colonists claimed they were unable to differentiate between South Asian faces, so Herschel mobilized fingerprinting as a means to prevent identity theft. As Sean Shu illuminates, Galton also reviews the proposal of a San Francisco photographer for the, quote, registration of Chinese whose identification has always been a difficulty. Gallen takes this false premise that non-white races have fewer distinguishing facial features and thereby more genetic uniformity in their fingerprints and tries to test it. Although he concedes that it might emphatically be said that there is no peculiar pattern associated with race, he continues, still, whether it be from pure fancy on my part or from the way in which they were printed or from some real peculiarity, the fingerprints of Black people still appear to him characteristic. So he acknowledges his own confirmation bias, but he still wants to prove the viability of tracking down both a specific individual and a whole race. So I would say that PUDDN'HEAD takes this aspiration, this like trying to track down an individual or race, and stretches it to its breaking point, asking what happens when involuntary identity theft, Tom and Chambers, enslaved and enslaver, swap, when that identity theft crosses a color line that reveals itself impossible to draw, since both of these babies and adults look white and had to be distinguished by their clothing when they were infants. Although he set the novel in the 1830s, Twain, of course, wrote in the Jim Crow era, in which mass migration and a heightened concern with miscegenation spurred new concern with racial categories. As Shu points out, fingerprinting in and out of this book became a technology for producing racial difference. Individuating Tom, only like pointing out who Tom is, only to confirm that he could then be categorized as part of a racial other, in this case, chattel slavery. As I mentioned earlier, in his initial draft, Twain wanted to undermine this ending, as if he still wasn't satisfied by the baby swap expose and its tragic consequences. So I think that when he writes, "This chapter could not be written on account of the weather," he's saying something about the climate, both in and of which he writes. And Twain resisted the constraints of weather literally. As with the orderliness of the detective plot, he refused to add normal references to weather in this novel. He had done something like this in American Claimant, where he'd put all weather into the appendix in the end. But in PUDDN'HEAD WILSON initially, he set up a weather sign system that I would say extends his commentary on fingerprinting. Let me show you. So in its first draft, Twain planned each chapter to include, alongside the heading of PUDDN'HEAD's maxims, a sketch of the weather in the scene to come. These signs were intended to, quote, instantly convey to the reader's mind a perfect comprehension of the kind of weather which is going to prevail below. But instead of deciding himself which weather should be assigned to which chapter, he deferred that choice to his printer. He instructed the printer to, quote, make facsimiles of those signs and use them at chapter tops. 1, sometimes 2. It's not necessary that they fit the weather of the chapter always. The only other guidance he provided was that the doubling of the signs could signify extremely violent and perilous weather, and that the conclusion to PUDDN'HEAD should treble all the weather signs and, quote, turn some of them upside down and others on their sides. This deteriorating of the very system of signage he set up anticipates the disarray of law and order that results in Tom's return to slavery and belies any neat ending. The weather design shows Twain, again, subverting circumstantial evidence. He introduces the shortcut of markings only to undermine their validity by making their selection totally random. As with the fingerprints, they're meant to index a particular identity, but are then used to signify much more than they can actually tell, once again creating space for confirmation bias. Curiously, but perhaps understandably, he cut this whole weather sign system before publication. And in the last section of my talk, I want to turn our attention to some of the other material he decided to delete. Redacting Twain, what he never published, and never said that he never published. A few things to note about his ending. I'm going to go back to that in 1 second. As already mentioned, about his editing. As already mentioned, the Clemenses were strapped for cash in the early 1890s, and so Twain was happy to gain the extra sum for including the fragments from those extraordinary twins alongside PUDDN'HEAD. We also know that Century magazine pushed Twain to sanitize many of his controversial references. He resisted vehemently, but caved to some revisions. For example, as Griffin points out, in the Morgan manuscript, Roxy claims to be a descendant of John Randolph, who was an actual senator and plantation owner who had died only 60 years prior to publication. So Century magazine replaces him ostensibly to avoid controversy and implicating him, this real person. Cross-referencing the Morgan manuscript with the final publication, as well as examining the redactions that he did during the writing of this first draft, there are 5 substantial deletions that are not simply revised and reprinted in those extraordinary twins or reworked, such as the endings or Driscoll's character or Tom's obsession with killing his dad. Here are the 5. There's a scene of sadism in which Tom tortures a spider. There's an episode with the slave Jasper and a horse. Roxy's description of the Grand Mogul steamboat. More insight into Percy Driscoll's racism, and more interior monologue from Tom when he confronts his ancestry. The latter 3 in particular directly address the question of what Twain calls habit versus heredity, and makes some of his most polemical comments not just on blackness, but also on the construction of whiteness. So for one, he cut the Grand Mogul steamboat, a veritable floating palace, coated with a highly polished skin of white paint. The scene is rife with deceptive appearances, for example, sugar cake temples, which are actually just decorated cheese boxes. But this view inspires in Roxy the reflection that, quote, the white man was in very truth a wonder-compelling creature and a creator of marvelous contrivances. The double meaning of contrivances here, though, implies the artificiality of white people's inventions, including perhaps the invention of whiteness itself, implied here to be a mere painting of surface. Twain had also written more about Percy Driscoll, which provided rationale for Roxy's decision to swap the children. It's a theft in his household that Percy responds to by threatening to sell his slaves downriver if no one owns up to it. And again, that's why Roxy decides to switch her child with the master's child. In the final publication, the narrator explains how even the enslaved deacon justified stealing trifles from the man who daily robbed him of an inestimable treasure, his liberty. But the passage originally continued in a rare first-person voice. This is also in your handout if you want to follow along. And if you haven't flipped the paper, it's on the back side also, page 2. We have been excusing the slave for stealing. It is but fair to excuse the master for what might seem to us rather poor indications of the presence of humanity and softness in his nature. But he was a humane man, and most decidedly and unquestionably so. It was totally impossible for him to deal ungently with a white person who appealed to him for grace, even a costly one. But he and his ancestors had always been slaveholders, and habit and heredity had made it impossible for him to realize that black people were human beings. Explaining slaves' petty thefts as retribution makes it into the final version, while a lengthy account of slaveholders' hypocrisy does not. This ironic characterization of Percy Driscoll, modeled actually in part off of Clemens's own father, goes on to include some of the ways Percy dehumanized the people he enslaved, including having taken one man, quote, from the midst of his humble black family and the friends of his childhood to exile him forever in a far land, and it never occurred to him, Percy, that that poor creature had a heart in his bosom to break and left hearts behind him that could break also. Again, Twain keeps in the published version only a short reference to Percy's self-congratulatory diary entry when he decides not to go through with his threat to sell anybody downriver. The rest of what's printed there, as you can see on this, was redacted. And finally, the notion of habit and heredity is further fleshed out in a scene when Tom first recognizes that he was born into a position of chattel slavery. Again, this scene did not make it to the final edition. His reflections initially included how, again in your handout, his blood degraded from original courage to cowardice. This is Tom's. Tom's blood degraded from original courage to cowardice by decades and generations of insult and outrage inflicted in circumstances which forbade reprisals and made mute and meek endurance the only refuge and defense. Whence came it that in him which was high, and whence that which was base? That which was high came from either blood and was the monopoly of neither color. But that which was base was the white blood in him, debased by the brutalizing effects of a long-drawn heredity of slave owning, with the habit of abuse which the possession of irresponsible power always creates and perpetuates by a law of human nature, so he argued. More than any other commentary throughout his drafts on the inconclusiveness of racial markers, these sentences most directly complicate race as a biological phenomenon. That which was high, the assumption of white supremacy, could in fact be the domain of either race. But baseness is specifically assigned to slave-owning and condoning whiteness. That he calls this habit of abuse something in the blood, as hereditary, goes to show the extent to which social customs of race and domination have become almost physically ingrained. It's also a comment that seems to mock rising racial sciences by blurring the lines between the biological, the blood-based, and what's socially constructed. Given the importance of Galton's fingerprints, it's likely that Twain might have read one of his earlier pieces, The History of Twins, also in your handout, which states there is no escape from the conclusion that nature prevails enormously over nurture, when the differences of nurture do not exceed what is commonly to be found among persons of the same rank of society and in the same country. In Pudd'n'head, the two boys are raised in contrasting ranks and racialized by their relations. But this deletion echoes what remains evident in the published version. The novel isn't so simply saying that nurture wins over nature. I think we should qualify Ron Chernow's conclusion in his recent biography that, quote, the entire point of Pudd'n'head Wilson is that our social status, not our biological identity, makes us who we are. These redacted pieces exhibit the ways that nurture, in fact, becomes nature, and how both might shape one's worst side, but otherwise can't really define character, or can't fully define character. None of the three fragments I just reviewed made it to the published text. And in fact, he took the word heredity completely out of the final version. And though Twain describes his jackleg manner of writing in the postscript, he doesn't actually mention any of these substantial deletions. There's much to speculate about why he cuts these sections and doesn't admit it. But that this is another mystery we could pursue furthers my argument that these joint works flaunt their inconsistencies and suggest that our search for some stable identity is itself flawed. Given Twain's resistance to oversimplified storylines and deductive detective plots, in conclusion, I want to close with a Toni Morrison quote. As Morrison names in a 1993 interview, what is exciting about American literature is that business of how writers say things under, beneath, and around their stories. Think of Pudd'n'head Wilson, and all these inversions of what race is, how sometimes nobody can tell, or the thrill of discovery. For us readers, there is a thrill of seeking this out, as well as the thrill, or the thrill of discovery. The inversions of what race is crisscross with Twain's inversions of how a story is supposed to be. For us readers, there's a thrill of seeking this out, as well as the thrill of deconstructing the fictions of law and custom. But like the tragedy he calls the tale, there's also the sober reckoning that those laws and customs endure in our habits and have become so entrenched as to be inheritable. Indeed, by bookending the novel with his own personal writing process, the conjoined works make us readers the jury, forcing us to turn the investigation toward ourselves. Thank you.